Alright, kia ora. I thought I'd go through a couple of really quick tips and some sort of myths associated with astrophotography. Now this is not so much on the shutter speed or anything, but two parts that I think people forget, and that's the aperture and the ISO. The common myths that I hear is that if you've got a really fast lens, like an f1.4 or an f1.8, you should set your lens to as fast as you can go. You can make it, you'll get much more light in that way, and you will have a much better shot. The second myth is with regards to ISO, and that the higher the ISO you have, the more noise and grain you're going to get. Both of those myths I kind of want to discuss today. So the first one, nice and easy. If you have a fast lens, if you've got a really fast lens, you should crank it up to go as fast as you can. That means the lowest f-stop number that you have. That means when you're taking a shot, as much light as possible is being let in. Here's an example of a shot that I took a few weeks ago with my Sigma 24mm f1.4. And this shot is taken at 24mm f1.4, the fastest this lens can go. And it's not bad. Down the middle, nice clarity there in the Milky Way. This was done at the time of the aurora, so we've got a little bit of color here. But let's see what happens when I set this with similar sort of settings to f2.8. Now I've had to bump up the ISO to compensate for the slower aperture, but if you compare the two, this is f2.8, and then going back, f1.4. Straight away, there is a marked difference. The vignetting around the edge, significantly worse with f1.4 versus f2.8. Now this is why a lot of people who are really into their astrophotography might stop down their lens a couple of stops. So if it's an f2.8 lens, shoot at f4. If it's an f1.4 lens, shoot at f2.8, or that's what I do. It just makes the process much, much better. So let's take a look in the corners. Now if you take a look in the corners, the coma is still a little bad, the barrel distortion is still a little bad at f2.8. That's typical of this Sigma lens in particular, but you compare that to the f1.4 lens, and you can see it's really bad. You know, lots of little birdies, sort of shapes flying around here. The sharpness is gone. In the middle, not too bad at all. It doesn't look like it's too sharp, but it's not too bad. On the edges, really bad. When we take a look at the middle here, much sharper. Okay. The other thing that makes shooting at night much better as well, when you're stopping down your lens, is that you can capture a little bit more of the foreground. So let's take a look at the foreground here at f2.8. It's still a little bit out of focus. That depth of field has meant that it's not super crisp, but when we compare it to the same spot at f1.4, much more blur there. You know, the depth of field has been really aggressive. Taking even closer in the foreground, it's pretty much unusable at the bottom there. And let's take a look here. It's not sharp, it's not super sharp, but much better. So first of all, if you have a really fast lens, great, fantastic. That does not mean you need to speed it up and run it as fast as it can go. Stop down a little bit and you'll get much crisper shots as a result. Okay, next one I want to talk about is with ISO. There is this myth or this perception that having a high ISO means you're going to get more noise. That is not always the case. ISO gets worse, and ISO higher ISO is going to create more noise if you try to, in general, lighten up darker shots. And this is kind of what happens with astro. We generally have darker shots, and so we are trying to lighten them up. Let me give you an example. This is a shot I took of my daughter a couple of weeks ago at her birthday party, and there's lots of dark space around it. Purposefully, I wanted to get the focus on her in the middle. Now in the lit areas, there's a little bit of noise, there's a little bit of grain, but it's not too offensive. Now this is shot at 3200 ISO. Now if you've got a better camera, it's always going to handle low light better, but that's not too bad. Look at the candles, you can almost see almost no noise at all. That's because the lit areas are compensating quite well. Now if I tried to brighten the background, and I try to bring up those shadows a bit, you can see there's a ton of noise in that dark space. There's definitely information. You know, you can see like a frame here in the background of a painting that we've got behind her. There's another something here. If I wanted, and I've even got a mug here I never even noticed before. If I wanted detail in those shadow dark areas, I'm really out of luck with this shot. It's not going to happen. This is why I like to take shots like this and have them dark. Keep them dark, perfectly fine. Have the focus on the lit areas. I might even bring those highlights down a little. Let me up the overall exposure, bring those highlights down a little, so you've got a little bit of dynamism there. You've got her right in the middle, and the noise isn't too bad. I mean, let's see if I can put some noise reduction on, maybe just 20%. This is just Lightroom, this is nothing too crazy, and already you've got a much smoother image, nice and simple. Let me give an example of an astro shoot where it is dark in the foreground and I've shot at high noise, high ISO, and what that does to noise. This is a shot I tried to take of Devil's Punch Bowl waterfall in Arthur's Pass, and I've set it at ISO 12800. Now this is high. This is probably the highest I've ever shot on my Sony A7 II. And you can see that it's pretty dark down here, and there's lots of lit area. This is the Milky Way over here. If I kind of reduce the exposure a bit, you can see a little bit more detail. Reduce the highlights a little, and you can see a little bit more. Okay. Now, if I wanted that foreground to be lit, this is where problem happens with a high ISO trying to lighten your shadows. And you can see there's lots of darkness here that's being lit up, getting that purple color casting. It's not the sharpest either, lots of noise, and this is where high ISO does affect your images. If you're going for a dark image and you're trying to lighten it, really not good. What I generally try to do is trying to take a shot of a dark area and overcompensate the shadows. So I end up darkening a light image rather than trying to brighten a dark image. Here's an example again. So going back to the Milky Way shot at the lake with the aurora, this was shot at f2.8, 24 millimeters, 20 seconds, and ISO 3200. Now 3200 should be less noise than ISO 10000. This shot is the same shot with ISO 10000 f2.8, 20 seconds. Now when you're looking at this one, you're kind of thinking, okay, that's good. I've got the Milky Way, I've got the structure, but if I wanted to brighten this, you're already starting to get a tiny bit of noise, not too much. We're getting a little color casting there. Okay. What else can I do? So I can bring up the shadows a tiny bit as well. Just trying to get a bit more brightness in the foreground. Now that's not too bad. It doesn't look like it's too offensive. It's quite a lit, bright area. The aurora was helping. Lots of cars going past, someone running around in the foreground here as well. So, not too bad. I'm getting a little bit of purple color casting here, which I don't really like, but not too bad. Now, if I go to the ISO 10000, now ISO 10000, nearly 3 times that of 3200, surely the noise will be much higher, and to be honest, even when you brighten it a little bit, you bring those shadows up, there's a bit of noise as before, but it's not as bad as you would expect. So ISO 3200 over here, ISO 10000, not a huge amount of difference. Just having a high ISO does not equal noise. It's all about how you have exposed your shot. So in this case, I've taken a shot and I've tried to bring it a little brighter, and then when I go to process it, I'll probably bring down the exposure a little bit so the focus is on the Milky Way, and then I can maybe lighten the foreground a little bit. So let me set the exposure here a little higher on the foreground. I can put a little gradient here, and it's not too offensive. If I was going to try and do a similar thing with this one and trying to brighten it, I'm going to have to brighten the sky and brighten the foreground. Maybe I'll have to reduce those shadows a little bit. It's starting to get a little messy. It's not impossible with this shot. But can I match it up the best I can? See, even then, this one still feels a little cleaner to me. Could be because of the highlights here, could be a range of things going on. But just having a high ISO doesn't necessarily mean you've got higher noise. It is about how bright your image is, it's how good your camera is, but more than anything, it's about how you're going to process your shots. And most astro shots, there's going to be processing afterwards. You can then add some noise reduction here, but to be honest, neither of these are too offensive. If you've got a shot like this, going back to this one, and I'm trying to brighten the foreground here, it's a really dark area, lots of shadows, and I'm trying to bring those shadows up, I'm going to be really out of luck. It's going to be really hard to recover this shot, and to the extent that I ended up throwing this shot away. I really wanted to have the falls and the Milky Way there, ended up not working, so I had to throw this one away. I did something else instead. Yeah, pretty much nothing is going to recover this. Let me even just put some clarity up to try and sharpen this foreground. Not going to work. So, play with your camera. See what works best. Generally, go and overexpose your night shots, especially if you're trying to incorporate some foreground and then darken it later. If that means having a high ISO, don't be afraid of that. Use your histogram. Now, this is something that I have started doing more so in the last year or so, is when I've got my camera and I'm reviewing shots, I look at the histogram and see how it looks in camera. So, this is a histogram here. When I was in a dark space, no light, out in the field, it looked really, really bright. It just seemed overexposed in the Milky Way. And this shot was actually at a +1 exposure, so it was overexposed in camera. But looking at the histogram, there's still plenty of information in the middle. In the middle, these are the midtones, plenty there. It's not out here on the far right. If I go to this one, there's far more out to the right, but too much darkness here. If I went and reset this, you can see a real bimodal sort of feel. Lots of lights, lots of highlights, lots of blacks and shadows here. This is what made this shot. Straight away I thought this isn't going to work too well when I get back to the computer to look at it. This one here, so this is straight off the camera. I've reset all the information. Lots of shadows, lots of blacks. I knew straight away if I was going to try and recover this, I'm going to need to try and lighten this whole area. When I start lightening dark shots, especially with high ISOs, even 3200 is relatively high, it's going to exaggerate the noise a bit more. It's much better to take a light shot and then try and calm it down a little bit. And then that will give us less noise, especially in the darker areas there. So hopefully that's been helpful. First up, if you are going to be using a fast lens, don't necessarily need to go at its fastest speed. It does affect the image quite a bit. And secondly, just because it's a high ISO doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up with more noise. The noise generally gets exaggerated when you're trying to brighten dark areas of a shot. So better to overexpose your shots and then darken them later rather than take a dark shot, try and brighten it, especially at high ISOs. Hopefully that's been useful. I'll catch you next time.